There's a moment that arrives without warning. You're sitting in a familiar room with familiar faces, and you feel it a quiet weight, not from the world outside, from inside the walls you call home. The Stoics believed that the greatest threats to a man's peace are rarely strangers. They are the people who know exactly where you're soft. We're taught early that blood means safety, that family means unconditional, that love from the people who raised you is the one thing you can count on. And most of us spend years, sometimes decades, defending that belief against the evidence in front of us. But Marcus Aurelius wrote something that stayed with me. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And sometimes, what stands in the way of your healing is not a bad habit or a fear of the unknown. It's a relationship. It's a pattern. It's a behavior you've been taught to accept because it came wrapped in the word family. This isn't about walking away from everyone you love. It's about learning to see clearly, because you cannot protect something you refuse to look at. Here are 10 toxic behaviors you should never tolerate, no matter who they come from. 1. Emotional manipulation. It rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive as a threat or an insult. It arrives as a sigh, a silence that stretches too long, a comment that lands softly but leaves a bruise. And before you understand what's happening, you're apologizing not for something you did, but for something you felt. Emotional manipulation works because it targets the one thing you trust most, your own perception of reality. The manipulator doesn't need to lie outright. They only need to make you doubt yourself just enough to stop trusting your instincts. In families, this is especially effective. You grew up believing these people wanted the best for you, so when guilt is used as a lever, you don't see danger, you see yourself as the problem. Epictetus said it plainly, "Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things." A manipulator's greatest tool is the opinion they plant inside you about yourself. Ask yourself one question. How many of your decisions were actually made from your own values, and how many were made to prevent someone's reaction? If the answer troubles you, that's not weakness, that's clarity arriving late. The shift is simple, though not easy. When someone uses guilt to steer you, you don't debate the guilt, you observe it. You ask where it came from. And then you respond from what you know to be true, not from the pressure to make the tension disappear. When you stop reacting to the tactic loses its leverage. What returns, slowly, is your own sense of direction. 2. Constant disrespect. Disrespect rarely comes dressed as disrespect. It comes as a joke, as just being honest, as that's how they've always been. It arrives in a tone, in a dismissive wave of the hand, in the way someone talks over you, like your words are background noise. And the dangerous part isn't any single moment, it's the accumulation. Hundreds of small moments you talked yourself out of taking seriously, until the weight of all of them sits permanently on your shoulders. What makes family disrespect different from any other kind is the expectation it betrays. These were supposed to be the people who saw your value most clearly. When they don't, something cracks in the way you see yourself. The Stoics made a clear distinction between what is in our control and what is not. Another person's words are not in your control, but what you accept as a definition of your worth that is entirely yours. Here's a question worth sitting with. If a colleague treated you the way this person does, would you still show up and say nothing? The answer tells you everything. Setting a boundary here doesn't require a confrontation. It requires a decision, a private, internal decision that certain behavior will no longer pass through you without acknowledgement. You don't have to perform anger. You don't have to punish anyone. You simply stop internalizing their carelessness as truth. And when you do, something quietly shifts. Your posture, your voice, the way you enter a room, because a person who knows their worth doesn't need to argue for it. They simply stop negotiating it away. 3. Boundary violations. Some people don't cross your limits dramatically. They simply never acknowledged that you had any. They comment on your choices without being asked. They enter your space, physical or emotional, without pausing to consider whether they're welcome. They treat your private life as shared property, because in their mind, closeness means access. And when you've grown up with this, it becomes invisible. You stop noticing the intrusions because you stopped expecting anything different. You start to believe that wanting space is somehow selfish. That needing privacy means you have something to hide. But Zeno, who founded Stoicism, built his philosophy around one core idea. The self must be governed from within, not from outside pressure, not from the expectations of others. A boundary isn't a wall built from resentment. It's a line drawn from self-knowledge. It says, "This is where I end, and where you begin." It's not rejection, it's definition. The people who push back hardest against your boundaries are often those who benefited most from your lack of them. Notice that. A person who loves you may not always understand your limit immediately, but they adjust. A person who wants control will punish you for having one. You don't need to explain your boundaries endlessly. You don't need to justify your right to a private inner world. State it once, clearly, calmly. Then enforce it without apology. Boundaries don't diminish relationships. They reveal which ones were real. 4. Envy, disguised as advice. This one is subtle enough that most people miss it for years. It doesn't sound like envy, it sounds like concern. "I just don't want to see you get hurt. Are you sure about this? People fail at this all the time. Be realistic." And because it comes from someone who supposedly cares about you, you receive it as wisdom. You slow down. You second guess. You put the idea back on the shelf where it collects dust. What you didn't see, what's difficult to see, is that their hesitation had nothing to do with your capability. It had everything to do with their own unexamined regrets. Seneca wrote, "It is not that I'm brave enough to speak truth. It is that I'm too tired to keep pretending." The person who discourages your growth isn't lying, exactly. They believe what they're saying. But what they're really expressing is their own unspoken fear. The fear that your success will illuminate the path they chose not to take. Growth exposes people, not deliberately, but inevitably. And those who haven't made peace with their own choices often respond to your progress by redirecting you back toward the safe and familiar. Pay attention to the pattern, not just the words. Does their advice consistently appear at the exact moment you gather momentum? Do they emphasize risk without ever exploring possibility? Do they celebrate your setbacks more easily than your wins? These are not signs of wisdom. They are signs of someone managing their own discomfort at your expense. Stop asking those people for permission, not out of arrogance, out of accuracy. Give your attention to people who have built something, not to people who specialize in explaining why building is dangerous. 5. Blaming others and never owning their actions. Some people have never once said, "I was wrong," without immediately following it with, "but you." They are never the cause, only the victim of circumstances, of other people's failures, of timing, of bad luck. Every confrontation somehow ends with you holding the weight they refuse to carry. Every argument concludes with you apologizing for a wound they inflicted. This is not an accident. It is a survival mechanism, and a sophisticated one. People who cannot face their own reflection learn to redirect your gaze before you can hold it steady. Marcus Aurelius returned to this theme repeatedly in his meditations. Not because blame shifting was uncommon in his time, it was everywhere, including inside the palace, but because he knew that a man who refuses to own his actions is a man who cannot change. The damage this does to you is quiet and cumulative. You begin to doubt your own memory. You replay conversations, searching for the moment where it became your fault. You apologize reflexively, not because you believe you were wrong, but because apologizing is the only way to make the room breathable again. Peace built on self-betrayal is not peace. It's silence wearing peace's clothing. Here is what clarity looks like in practice. You stop trying to win the argument. You stop looking for acknowledgement that will never arrive. You hold your own account of events, not defensively, not loudly, just firmly. This is what happened. I don't need your agreement to know it. When you stop absorbing blame that isn't yours, two things happen simultaneously. They lose the comfort of having a surface to deflect onto, and you regain the quiet strength of standing inside your own truth. That strength, once found, is very hard to take away. 6. Emotional neglect. Not all absence makes noise. Some of the loneliest moments in a person's life happen in full rooms surrounded by family, at a table set for many, inside a home with lights on and voices present. Lonely, not because no one was there, but because no one ever really asked. Emotional neglect is invisible damage. There are no events to point to, no obvious wounds to show. Just a slow, steady accumulation of moments when your inner world went unacknowledged until you stopped expecting it to be. You learned to be strong early, not because you were naturally resilient, but because vulnerability led nowhere. You learned to carry things alone, not out of pride, but because putting them down and waiting for someone to notice taught you that waiting was a form of disappointment you could avoid. And the most lasting effect of this isn't what you feel, it's what you stop expecting. The Stoics wrote often about oikeiosis, a natural orientation toward connection, toward belonging, toward being known. When that is denied long enough, something quietly restructures itself inside a person. You begin to believe that needing things from others is a burden, that being seen is for other people. Some families provide everything measurable: shelter, education, opportunity, and leave entirely unmeasured the one thing that shapes a person most, the sense that their inner life matters. Recognition is the first step, not blame recognition. Seeing the pattern for what it was, not as a verdict on your worth, but as an explanation for patterns you've carried forward. From that recognition, a different kind of care becomes possible. You begin offering yourself what was withheld. You begin choosing relationships measured not by what's provided, but by what's actually felt. Presence that only runs one direction is not relationship, it's labor. 7. Control through money, obligation, or fear. Help that comes with a leash is not help. It is investment, and the return expected is your compliance. This form of control is among the hardest to name because it hides inside generosity. Someone pays your way, supports you through difficulty, sacrifices for you, and slowly those acts accumulate into a ledger. Not a ledger they show you, one they keep privately and present selectively. Whenever you start moving in a direction they didn't approve. After everything I've done, you know how much I've given up. Family doesn't turn their back. These sentences are not reminders. They are tools, instruments designed to redirect you back inside a boundary you never agreed to. And then there is fear, quieter, more patient. Not physical fear necessarily, but the fear of disappointing someone, of becoming the ungrateful one, the difficult one, the one who broke the family. This kind of fear doesn't require raised voices. It only requires that you have cared once about someone's opinion of you. Epictetus, who was born into slavery and built an entire philosophy of freedom from within that condition, understood this distinction better than most. External circumstances can constrain the body. Only you can constrain the self. No man is free who is not master of himself. True support gives without accounting. It helps because it wants you to grow, not because it wants to hold the debt. The difference between the two is not always visible at first, but you feel it. A generosity that expands you feels different from a generosity that quietly diminishes you each time it's mentioned. You are not obligated to shrink your life in exchange for having been helped. You are not a debt that must be continuously repaid. You are a person, and your choices belong to you, regardless of who paid for the table you're sitting at. 8. Chronic victim mentality. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from living inside someone else's story, always cast as the one who failed them, the one who didn't do enough, the one whose simple act of having needs somehow caused them harm. A person with a fixed victim identity doesn't just avoid accountability, they reorganize events so that accountability becomes structurally impossible for them to reach. Every conflict is something that happened to them. Every consequence is someone else's fault. Every attempt you make to address their behavior becomes, in their retelling, evidence of your cruelty. And if you are empathetic, which you probably are, or this pattern wouldn't have lasted as long as it did, their pain feels real enough that you keep adjusting yourself in response to it. Here is the Stoic distinction that matters. Suffering and manipulation are not the same thing. A person can carry genuine pain and still use it as a weapon. Compassion for the first does not require you to submit to the second. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the importance of seeing things as they are, not as we wish them to be, not as others insist they must be, but as they actually are. Chronic victim behavior, seen clearly, is a strategy, not always a conscious one, but a strategy nonetheless, one that keeps its user protected from the discomfort of self-examination at the cost of everyone around them. The moment you stop performing the role they've written for you, the story cannot continue in its current form. That disruption will not be welcomed. They may escalate. They may become louder in their suffering, but they are not reacting to your behavior. They are reacting to the loss of a dynamic that served them. You are allowed to have your own account of events. You are allowed to hold it quietly and firmly, even without their acknowledgement. And you are allowed to step back from conversations designed not to resolve anything, but to reassign blame. Your truth does not require their signature to be valid. 9. Rage, outbursts, and intimidation. If you grew up around unpredictable anger, your body learned things your mind is still trying to unlearn. The way you monitor a room when someone enters, the speed at which you read a face, a tone, a silence. The way you rehearse your words before you speak them, running them through a filter designed to minimize the chance of eruption. These are not personality traits, they are adaptations. And they cost something. They cost the ease of simply existing without preparation. Explosive anger in a family environment is not passion. It is not strength. It is a failure of self-governance dressed as authority. The Stoics were unambiguous on this point. Anger, left unexamined, doesn't demonstrate power, it surrenders it. A person ruled by their reactions is not free. They are at the mercy of every circumstance that fails to meet their expectations. But understanding this about the person who raged at you is not the same as recovering from having lived inside their volatility. That is a slower process. What helps is a simple reorientation. Their anger was never actually about you, not at its root. You were the closest surface available when something inside them they hadn't dealt with came looking for an exit. You were not the cause, you were the location. This doesn't minimize what you experienced, it simply removes the false responsibility you may have carried since. And when that false responsibility is set down, the nervous system begins, slowly, to learn a different baseline, one where your calm is not dependent on someone else's mood. A relationship where you must stay small to avoid igniting someone else is not safety. It is captivity with familiar furniture. Your voice has a right to exist. Your presence has a right to take up space. And the measure of whether a relationship is healthy is simple. Do you feel free to be a person inside it? 10. Conditional love. This is the one that goes deepest, and the one most people take longest to name. Conditional love doesn't announce its terms. It simply withholds warmth when the terms aren't met. You learn, through repetition, which version of you is welcome, and you learn to present only that version, hiding the rest somewhere no one can penalize you for it. The result is a particular kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being accepted only partially. Of knowing that the acceptance you receive is addressed to a performance, not to you. Epictetus wrote about the role we play in life and the importance of playing it well, but never confusing the role with the self. Many people who grew up under conditional love made the opposite mistake. They buried the self to perfect the role, and then spent years wondering why belonging still felt hollow. Here is the clearest truth about conditional love. It was never a verdict on your worth. It was a reflection of someone else's limited capacity. A person who cannot love without control is not withholding something you failed to earn. They are demonstrating something they never learned to give. This distinction matters because it determines what you do next. If the love was withheld because you were insufficient, the response is to keep proving yourself. But if it was withheld because of their incapacity, the response is entirely different. You stop auditioning and you start asking what kind of love you actually want in your life. Unconditional love is not a myth, but it begins internally. It begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself to remain acceptable to someone who placed conditions on your worth. It begins when you stop editing your existence for an audience that was never going to applaud the real version of you anyway. And from that beginning, something opens relationships with people who don't need you to be smaller, quieter, or more convenient. People who can be present with the actual you, not the approved version. That is not a luxury. That is the baseline. Look back at what you've carried. Most of it didn't come from failure. It didn't come from bad luck or personal weakness. It came from proximity, from being close to people whose patterns were more powerful than your ability, at the time, to recognize them. That recognition, arriving now, is not a wound reopened. It is a door. The Stoics didn't ask us to become indifferent to people or to harden ourselves against connection. They asked us to see clearly, to distinguish between what is within our control and what is not, between what is ours to carry and what has simply been placed on us by habit and expectation. Awareness is where freedom begins, not the dramatic kind, not the kind you announce, the quiet kind. The kind where you simply stop accepting certain things without explanation, where your inner life becomes non-negotiable, where peace is something you maintain rather than something you wait for others to grant you. You are not here to be shaped by someone's anger, measured by someone's expectations, or diminished by someone's unexamined pain. You are here to grow, to build something real, to move through life with the kind of clarity that only comes when you've finally decided that your interior world belongs to you. And when you make that decision, not loudly, not bitterly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has looked at things honestly, your life begins to change in ways you cannot fully anticipate. Not because the people around you suddenly improve, but because you do.